Welcome back, everybody. Today's topic is the 5 biggest mistakes that people make when starting new businesses. So if you're an entrepreneur, startup, small business, that kind of thing, this is going to be important information for you. As always, if you're enjoying the information on the channel, give a like and subscribe. Let's get going. As an introductory note, as always, this is not legal advice. Every situation is different. And just because I say that something is the case for most situations does not mean that it is the case for your situation. Now, number 1, the first biggest mistake that people make when starting a new business is they fail to put it in a legal entity. Now, that can mean starting a business as a sole proprietorship, which is almost always a bad idea, or it can mean doing a sole proprietorship with a DBA. And a lot of people are under the misimpression that a DBA is somehow equivalent to a corporation or an LLC or a partnership or other kind of business entity. It is absolutely not the same. A DBA does not block liability in the same way that an LLC, partnership, corporation, etc. will. And the first thing you should talk to your business attorney about is forming an entity for your business. If failing to put your business in an entity is the number 1 biggest mistake, then the number 2 biggest mistake of people starting a business is failing to follow the required formalities of that business entity. Now, just because you put your new business in an LLC, that's not the end of the story. You're not one and done. There are various things that need to be done to follow up and to prove that your new business organization is legitimate. That means things like an operating agreement or bylaws or partnership agreement. That means things like organizational minutes, director minutes, shareholder consents, member consents. That means things like meetings of the members, meetings of the shareholders, all of these formalities, all this paper that has to be done to prove that your business entity really is a separate thing. Now, why does this matter? Well, there is something called, and you may have heard of it, there is something called piercing the corporate veil. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means that if someone's suing you, if you haven't really respected your business entity, the person who's suing you can penetrate the corporate veil and look behind the business entity to get to your assets personally. Obviously, that's the whole point of what we're trying to avoid. So talk to your attorney and avoid the number 2 mistake, which is not following the required formalities of your business entity. The number 3 biggest mistake of people starting new businesses is failing to use a written contract or using an inappropriate written contract. You got to have a good, solid, well-drafted, preferably in consultation with an attorney, written contract or contracts that you're going to do business with, right? Now remember, we've talked about on this channel before that a contract doesn't necessarily have to be in writing in order to be enforceable. A contract can be solely verbal. A handshake agreement can be enforceable. Remember the Joe Jamail Texaco Pennzoil debacle. However, it's very important as a best practices matter for you as a new business owner to use a written contract for simply evidentiary concerns. Very rare is the case that you have someone using a defense of, oh, we just had a handshake, but because there's no written agreement, it's not enforceable. Much more likely will be the person who says, well, it's not in writing, so it didn't happen. So get it in writing, use a good written contract, and what I highly recommend in this regard is that you spend a little bit of time with your attorney to develop a really solid, really good written agreement, and then you can use that written agreement over and over and over. You can use it more than once. So once you have this language and these terms really nailed down to what you want, you're not restricted to just using it a single time. You can use it many different times. So you can develop maybe a handful of form contracts and use each one of them 100 different times. That's what big companies do. There's no reason that a small company shouldn't be able to do it. So talk to your business attorney about developing a strong suite of written agreements for whatever line of business you're in. The number 4 big mistake that people make when starting new businesses is failing to protect their intellectual property. Now, as we've talked about before, there are kind of 3 basic buckets in terms of IP. You have copyright, you have patent, and you have trademark. Now, these 3 things are sort of beyond the scope of this video, but you should be aware that if you're doing something novel in terms of IP, particularly if you're in the computer space or if you've invented something or that kind of thing, you really need to be aware of whether your invention, whether your product, whatever it may be, is protectable in terms of trademark or patent or this kind of thing. And if it is, then maybe start taking the steps towards protecting it, or at least have that conversation with an IP attorney about whether that's a worthwhile investment to do. Because the last thing that you want to happen is to invest all of this money and all of this time into your startup and then have someone else swoop in from underneath your nose and take it because you failed to protect your idea with the USPTO. So have that conversation early on about whether your business is protectable in terms of intellectual property. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but this should inform your business plan. So the fifth and final area that we're going to talk about today is employee matters. Now, we could easily talk for a few hours about HR. I'm going to talk about kind of three specific sub areas here. We're going to talk about NDAs, we're going to talk about non-competes, and we're going to talk about very briefly HR matters. So first, NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. What does this mean? Well, it covers confidential information that is, say, proprietary or secret, trade secret, or otherwise secret information of your business, to where employees, contractors, etc. can't go disclose that information to anyone that they want to. Now, obviously, you want to take care to ensure that your trade secrets are not disclosed to people who don't necessarily need to know. But for employees who do need to know, you want to make sure that they're signed up to a strong, robust NDA that will give you some options if they attempt to go sell your information to a competitor in the market. The second area under this is non-compete agreements. Now, this is something that a ton of companies in Texas get wrong because Texas has relatively strict rules on what non-compete agreements are enforceable. So you can't just say, look, if you ever work for our company, you can never compete with us for the next 10 years anywhere in the United States. Texas courts will not enforce that, and the band of non-compete agreements that Texas courts will enforce is actually relatively narrow, so this is something that you need to consult with an attorney on. However, for a lot of businesses, having a good, solid non-compete can do a lot of good for their business, can do a lot of help. So talk to your attorney about what sort of non-compete might be justifiable under your circumstances and how that can be narrowly drafted to where a court will actually enforce it. And the third area, as I said, is some basic HR requirements. So things like hiring employees pursuant to an offer letter that sets forth the terms of the employment, things like at-will employment, things like a probation period, things like job duties, things like salary, that will remove all doubt in the event of a subsequent unemployment proceeding. In addition, following basic HR best practices as far as employee handbooks, various policies and procedures, termination procedures, all of this kind of thing can really, really be helpful for reducing that employee risk that a early stage startup will potentially run into. So that's all for today, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have other mistakes that you think are some of the biggest mistakes that businesses make when first starting up, feel free to share that in the comments. Otherwise, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see y'all next time. Thanks for tuning in.